She was black, beautiful, and standing in the most expensive room in Seoul, and they made sure she felt every bit of that difference. The chandeliers were Venetian crystal. The flowers were flown in from Jeju Island that same morning. 200 guests dressed in old money and careful ambition filled the Grand Kwan Hotel ballroom. And Amara walked in wearing red, and the room noticed. But so did the wrong person. The most powerful woman in Seoul crossed that marble floor with a folded fan and a smile that never once reached her eyes. And she looked Amara up and down, slowly, deliberately. And then she said it, quietly, almost gently, the way people say things when they want the cruelty to land without leaving a mark. Korean men don't date black women. A pause. Especially not men from my family. She said it like a diagnosis, like a door being closed, like a verdict that was never meant to be appealed. What she did not count on was that the woman standing in front of her had spent her entire life walking through doors that were closed to her. And somewhere across that glittering ballroom, at the head of the VIP table, sat the most dangerous man in Seoul, Kwon Jae-won, the man they called Saja, the lion, with a dragon tattooed up his neck and an empire built on controlled fear, sitting alone in a room full of people, looking like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised by anything. He was about to remember. What happened next changed everything. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The chandeliers above the Grand Kwan Hotel ballroom had been imported from Venice. Every single one. 42 of them, each one a constellation of hand-cut crystal that scattered golden light across the marble floors like something between a cathedral and a dream. The staff had spent 11 hours arranging the tables. The flowers, white peonies flown in from Jeju Island that same morning, sat in their vases with the rigid perfection of things that exist purely to be looked at and never touched. 200 guests filled the room, dressed in the language of old money and careful ambition. The men wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salaries and said nothing interesting. The women wore jewelry that told their family histories in carats and settings. Everyone smiled. Everyone was watching everyone else. This was not a party. It was a performance of a party, executed with the precision of people who had been performing their entire lives and no longer remembered what the alternative felt like. And then Amara Ose walked through the main corridor at 9:03, and the performance stuttered. She did not rush. She never rushed. She had learned long ago that rushing was what people did when they were not sure they deserved to be somewhere. And Amara had spent years being absolutely certain that she deserved to be everywhere she chose to enter. The red dress moved with her like it had been sewn directly onto her skin. Deep crimson, fitted and elegant, modest at the neckline, but impossible to ignore in every other way, because it was not the fabric that demanded attention. It was the woman inside it. The dark richness of her skin caught the chandelier light and held it, warm and golden, as if the room had been lit specifically for her arrival. Her afro, full and sculpted, carried small gold accessories tucked into the coils near the crown of her head, subtle enough that you had to look twice to see them, deliberate enough that she had chosen each one carefully that morning. She was there professionally. The Atlas Diplomatic Partners firm had contracted her services as an interpreter for the international business guests attending Madame Kwan's 62nd birthday celebration. Her presence was documented, approved, and entirely legitimate. She had the badge in her clutch, small and gold and metallic, held loosely in her left hand, to prove it, though she never imagined she would need to prove anything that night. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray without breaking her stride, scanned the room once with the practiced eye of someone who reads spaces for a living, and went to work. She introduced herself to 3 German executives near the east wall, shifted languages mid-sentence twice without a pause, laughed at the right moment, and held her silence at the right moment, and made everyone she spoke to feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. It was a skill. It was also, in a way, a kind of armor. If she was focused on making others comfortable, there was no space left in the moment for anyone to make her uncomfortable. She had not yet counted on Madame Kwan. She felt the woman's approach before she saw her. There was a particular quality to the air that shifted when someone with absolute authority moved through a space. A subtle parting, a slight straightening of spines in the periphery. The micro-adjustments of people who had been trained by proximity to power to respond to it physically without being told. Amara had spent enough time in rooms with powerful people to recognize that shift. She turned just as Madame Kwan Myung-hee arrived. The woman was smaller than Amara had expected. She always was. The truly powerful ones. 62 years old, and every single one of them worn like a credential. The hanbok she wore was the green of deep jade, the kind of color that does not shout but simply is, embroidered in gold thread with patterns that Amara recognized as traditional but could not fully translate. A folding fan of mother of pearl rested closed in her right hand. Her hair was silver and arranged in a perfect coque at the back of her head. Her skin was pale and immaculate, and her posture was the posture of a woman who had never once in her life stood with her weight distributed apologetically. She looked at Amara. Not a glance, a look. The kind that travels from the shoes upward and takes its time and does not pretend otherwise. And then she smiled. It was an extraordinary smile, Amara would think later. It had all the technical components of warmth. The slight lift of the cheeks, the softening around the eyes, the gentle tilt of the head. But it reached none of those places, actually. It was a smile that had been constructed so many times over so many decades that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing to anyone who was not paying close attention. Amara was always paying close attention. "What a bold dress," Madame Kwan said in Korean, her voice low and smooth, the kind of voice that has never needed to raise itself because the world has always leaned in to hear it. "You work for the Atlas firm, don't you?" Interpretation. "Yes, Madame Kwan." Amara's Korean was precise, her accent controlled and professional. "It is an honor to be here this evening. Happy birthday." The matriarch inclined her head. Not a bow, something shallower than that. Something that said, "I acknowledge you," without saying, "I receive you." And closed the fan slowly in her right hand. "Let me tell you something, my dear." The phrase she used, the Korean term that translated loosely as "my daughter" or "my child," was the kind that could be tender or condescending, depending entirely on the speaker's intent. And Madame Kwan's intent was surgical. "You are exotic, interesting. But Seoul has its traditions. Families here have their expectations." She paused. One beat, perfectly timed. "Korean men do not date black women." She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. Calm, final, delivered for the patient's own benefit. Especially not men from my family. And then she turned. The fan opened again as she moved away, and her two silent attendants fell back into orbit around her, as if drawn by gravity. And within 4 seconds, she was absorbed back into the crowd, and the crowd closed around her, and the space where she had stood was just space again, holding nothing but the echo of what she had said. Amara stood still. She was good at still. She had learned it young. The particular discipline of not letting what you feel travel to your face before you have decided what to do with it. She breathed in through her nose, slow and measured, and she felt the heat rise through her chest, and her jaw tighten, and her fingers press almost imperceptibly against the gold clutch in her hand. 2 seconds passed. She lifted the champagne glass and drank. And then, because Amara Ose had spent her entire life being told in various languages and various tones, and with various degrees of elegance, that there were rooms she did not belong in, and because she had walked into every single one of them anyway, she turned her eyes toward the center of the ballroom and looked at the VIP table. He was impossible to miss. Not because he was performing the way the others were performing, because he wasn't. Kwon Jae-won sat at the head of the table in his black suit, like a man who was physically present and mentally elsewhere. Dark eyes moving over the room with the detached assessment of someone cataloging exits rather than enjoying an evening. The tattoo climbed his neck in black ink. She could see it from here. The dragon's lines rising from his collar and curving toward his jaw. And the watch on his wrist caught the light once as he reached for his glass and set it back down without drinking. He was the most dangerous man in Seoul. He looked like he hadn't slept in a year. Amara looked at him for 3 full seconds. And in those 3 seconds, something quiet and decisive happened inside her. Not anger exactly, and not strategy exactly, but the particular clarity that arrives when you have been told no by the wrong person, and the wrongness of it becomes its own kind of fuel. Madame Kwon had meant to send her toward the door. Instead, she had sent her toward the table. Amara set her champagne glass on the nearest surface, adjusted the clutch in her hand, and began to move through the crowd toward the VIP section with the same unhurried certainty with which she had entered the building 20 minutes ago. Little did Madame Kwon know, watching from behind her fan across the room, already congratulating herself on having handled the situation, that those 12 words she had delivered with such elegant finality had not closed a door. They had opened one, and her son was sitting directly on the other side of it. The crowd parted for her without knowing it was parting. That was the thing about moving with certainty. The world tended to accommodate it without being asked. Amara crossed the ballroom floor with her eyes fixed on the VIP table and her expression carrying exactly the right amount of calm, which is to say the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the complete mastery of it. Around her, the party continued its elaborate performance. The quartet shifted into something slower. Glasses clinked. Laughter arrived in practiced waves. None of it touched her. She was aware, in the peripheral way of someone whose profession demanded constant environmental reading, that eyes were following her. Not all eyes, but enough. She was used to being watched in rooms like this. She had learned to let the attention pass through her like weather, neither welcomed nor resisted. What she was not willing to let pass through her was what Madame Kwon had said. That she carried differently. That she held close to the center of her chest like something with weight and heat, and she used that weight and that heat the way her mother had always told her to use the things that tried to diminish her. As information, as fuel, as direction. One of the security men stationed at the perimeter of the VIP section stood as she approached. He was large in the way that men chosen specifically for presence are large. Broad and still, his suit jacket straining slightly at the shoulders, his expression professionally empty. He did not speak. He simply stood in a way that meant stop. Amara did not stop. She slowed, which was different, and she held the man's gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who has negotiated in 3 languages in the same afternoon and does not find silence intimidating. And she waited. From behind the security man, from the head of the table, came 2 fingers raised almost imperceptibly. A gesture so small that if you were not watching the right person at the right moment, you would have missed it entirely. The security man registered it without looking. These men were trained to receive signals through some frequency that seemed to bypass ordinary human senses. And he stepped aside. Amara walked to the edge of the table. Kwon Jae-won looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a calculation and was waiting to see if the result would be interesting. His eyes were dark and still and gave away very little. But they gave away enough. They did not slide away from her face the way eyes did when the person behind them had already decided the interaction was beneath them. They stayed. And in the staying, they asked a question they would not yet form into words. She stood across from him, the width of the white-clothed table between them, and for a moment she simply let that space exist. She had learned that silence was a language too, and that most people rushed to fill it out of nervousness, and that what a person used to fill silence told you almost everything you needed to know about them. He did not fill it. She respected that immediately. Kwon Jae-won, she said in Korean, the name landing without ceremony, without the honorific cushioning that everyone else in that building would have wrapped around it automatically. Just the name, clear and direct. I've heard you're the most dangerous man in Seoul. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. You look bored. Something moved across his face. It was fast, a flicker behind the eyes, a barely perceptible shift at the corner of his mouth. And then it was gone, sealed back beneath the composure. But she had seen it, and he knew she had seen it. And that knowing passed between them like a current through water, invisible and immediate. And you are? His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had never needed volume because the room always went quiet enough to hear it. Amara. She offered nothing else. No firm name, no title. No explanation of why she was standing at his table uninvited at his mother's birthday celebration, in a red dress with gold stilettos and a look in her eyes that suggested she had already decided how this conversation would end. He studied her for a moment. Not with the evaluating look that men sometimes used on women in rooms like this. The look that measured and categorized and ultimately reduced. This was something different. This was the look of someone trying to identify something unfamiliar, which was itself unfamiliar to him, because Kwon Jae-won had not encountered something he could not immediately identify in a very long time. You know who you're talking to, he said. It was not quite a question. I do, she answered. And then, because this was the moment, and she had already committed fully to it the second she left that champagne glass on the stranger's table and started walking. And you know what your mother said to me 20 minutes ago. The shift this time was not in his eyes. It was in his jaw. A tightening, minute and controlled, but there. The physical signature of a man who had heard something he recognized. Something that carried a history he had not invited into this conversation, but that had arrived in it anyway. He said nothing. She leaned forward over the table, both palms pressing flat against the white cloth, her weight shifting forward and down, bringing her face close enough to his that the space between them became something personal, something that could not be shared with the rest of the room. She moved slowly enough that it was not a surprise, quickly enough that it was not a question. The red dress followed the lean with quiet elegance, the gold accessories in her hair catching the chandelier light as she brought herself level with his eyeline. His jaw tightened further. His eyes did not move from hers. She could see the precise moment that something behind them, some deeply embedded reflex of control and composure, made contact with something else. Something older than composure. Something that had been sitting under the surface of a man who had spent 18 years making every room afraid of him, and had not once in all that time been looked at the way she was looking at him now. Not afraid. Not calculating. Not performing. Just present. Fully, dangerously, entirely present. "You should be leaving," he said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had changed. A thread of something underneath the evenness. Not weakness, not quite, but the place where evenness ends and the thing it is covering begins. "I should be," she agreed, and the agreement carried in it the full weight of the fact that she was not going anywhere. "But I never do what I'm told." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted them, the way she had learned to count the silences in negotiations. Each second its own small data point, its own small revelation about the person on the other side of the table. At the second, his shoulders dropped 1 millimeter. Imperceptible to anyone who was not looking for it. At the 4th second, he said, "Sit down." It was not a request. It was Kwon Jae-won, and Kwon Jae-won did not make requests. But something in the delivery, something beneath the command's architecture, was not quite as sealed as it was supposed to be. And Amara heard that. She heard the thing beneath the thing. She was, after all, an interpreter. It was what she did. She listened to what people said, and she heard what they meant. And what Jae-won meant was not sit down in the way he meant it when he said it to his lieutenants, and they sat before the echo had finished traveling. What he meant was, "You are the first thing in this room tonight that I want to keep looking at." She considered him for one measured moment, long enough to let him understand that the decision was hers. And then she sat. Across the ballroom, behind the slow opening of a mother-of-pearl fan, Madame Kwon Young-hee stood very still. She had been watching since the moment the woman in red began moving through the crowd with that particular walk. The walk of someone who had somewhere specific to be, and no patience for the architecture of hesitation. She had watched the security man step aside. She had watched her son raise 2 fingers. She had watched the woman lean over the table and bring her face close to Jae-won's. And she had watched her son's jaw tighten and his shoulders shift and his eyes stay fixed on a face they had no business being fixed on. And she had watched him tell her to sit down. And the woman had sat. Madame Kwon closed the fan. She had spent 40 years building the walls around her son with precision and patience. Every approved social connection, every vetted relationship, every gentle redirection away from women who were unsuitable, which was a category she had always defined with complete authority and never questioned. She had built those walls because walls kept things out, yes, but more importantly because walls kept things in. And what she needed kept in was a son who ran an empire the way she had designed it to be run, connected to the right families, aligned with the right futures, untouched by the kind of feeling that made men make decisions their mothers had not approved. She had never once considered that the wall might have a door. And yet here was a woman in a red dress sitting at her son's table. And here was her son leaning, barely, almost invisibly, but undeniably, forward. "Madam," one of her attendants appeared at her left shoulder. "Should we—" "No," she said quietly. She needed to watch first. She needed to understand what she was dealing with. Because Kwon Myung-hee had not built an empire by acting before she understood the full shape of the threat in front of her. And what was sitting across from her son right now, composed and red and entirely unafraid, was the most interesting threat she had encountered in a very long time. Little did she know that the woman across the room was thinking the exact same thing about her. They talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Amara knew the exact duration because she had glanced at the slim gold watch on her right wrist when she sat down. A habit, professional and automatic. The kind of thing interpreters did in rooms where time was someone else's money. And she glanced at it again when the last of the formal dinner guests began filtering toward the exit corridor and the quartet packed their instruments with the quiet efficiency of people who had performed at enough of these evenings to know when the real night was ending. 2 hours and 17 minutes. And in all that time, not once did Kwon Jae-won look at anything else in the room. She had not expected that. She had expected the performance of attention, the half-listening that powerful men deployed when they wanted someone to feel seen without the inconvenience of actually seeing them. She knew that performance intimately. She had watched it executed across 3 continents and 4 languages, and had learned to work around it, to deliver exactly what was needed in the space between a man's actual attention and his performed version of it. Chae-won did not perform. That was the thing she kept returning to, the thing that kept catching her slightly off guard in the way that only genuinely unexpected things did. He listened the way people listened when they had stopped pretending the conversation was beneath them. When she spoke, he waited until she had fully finished. Not the waiting of someone composing their response while you are still talking, but the waiting of someone who needed to hear the end of the sentence before they knew what to do with the beginning of it. It was, she thought, the listening of a man who was almost never listened to in return. They did not talk about the empire. They did not talk about the organization or the territory or the infrastructure of controlled violence and cultivated legitimacy that every person in that building understood, on some level, to be the real foundation beneath the marble floors and the Venetian chandeliers. Those things existed the way weather existed, as constant and structural fact, not as subject of conversation. They talked about soul, about the way the city existed in layers, the ancient and the ultra-modern pressed so close together that sometimes, walking certain streets at certain hours, you could feel both centuries at once. He knew the city the way people knew things they had never chosen to love, but had loved anyway, by proximity and duration and the slow accumulation of a life lived entirely inside something. She knew it differently, from the outside in, through the particular intimacy of a foreigner who had learned a language deeply enough to think in it, which meant learning not just the words, but the silences between words, the things that could not be said directly and were therefore said sideways, in implication and omission, and the precise angle of a pause. "You think in Korean," he said at one point. It was not a question. He had heard something in her phrasing, some structural choice in the way she built a sentence that told him. "When I need to," she said. "And when you don't need to?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, because it was, she realized, a real question. The kind that had a real answer and deserved one. In the language that fits what I'm trying to say. Sometimes that's Korean, sometimes English. Sometimes neither one has the right shape for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what language are you thinking in right now? She looked at him directly. I haven't decided yet. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the place just before a smile. The tectonic movement beneath the surface that preceded it. It lasted half a second, and then the composure reassembled itself. But she had seen it, and it sat inside her chest with a warmth she was careful not to examine too closely. It was around this point that she became aware of something she had been peripherally registering for the past 40 minutes, but had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. Chae-won had not been leaning back in his chair for some time. The posture he had arrived at gradually, over the course of the evening, was the posture of a man tilted forward. Not dramatically, not in the way that would be visible from across the room to anyone glancing over, but forward, toward her. The direction of his body had reversed itself at some point, without either of them noting the moment it happened. And now the space between them across the table was meaningfully smaller than it had been when she sat down. She noted this the way she noted everything. Filed it. Continued. The waitstaff moved through the room with the particular invisibility of people trained to service spaces without disturbing them. The remaining guests gathered in smaller clusters near the bar and the East Terrace. The birthday celebration was concluding its formal arc and settling into the looser, quieter territory of endings. And then, Madame Kwan crossed the room. Amara felt her coming before she saw her. The same atmospheric shift as before, the same subtle reorganization of the air around a woman who had spent 6 decades ensuring that her arrival was always felt. She did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was in the middle of, cleanly and without rushing, and only then turned her head. Madame Kwan stood at the edge of the table. Her eyes moved to her son first, a long, reading look. The look of a woman cataloging exactly what she saw and measuring it against what she had expected. And then to Amara. The fan was closed in her right hand. Her expression was the expression of someone who had arrived at a decision. Chae-won? Her voice was the same as it had been earlier in the evening. Smooth. Final. The voice of a woman who stated things rather than asking them, because asking implied the possibility of a different answer. It is late. Chae-won looked at his mother. The shift in him was immediate and involuntary. A straightening, a subtle retraction, the physical memory of 1,000 evenings in which that voice had meant something was ending, whether or not he was finished. It was the movement of a man who had learned very young that the sound of his mother's voice in a certain register was not an invitation to negotiate. He rose. Not because he wanted to. Amara could see that with complete clarity. The want to stay was there, visible in the half-second delay between hearing the words and acting on them, visible in the way his eyes moved back to her face one more time before he stood fully. But he rose, and that rising told her something important about the architecture of this family. Something she had already suspected from the 12 words delivered earlier in the evening, but now understood at a structural level. He stood. He was taller than the table had made him seem. The tattoo on his neck was fully visible now, the dragon's lines rising from the collar of the black suit, climbing the side of his throat with a kind of dark elegance, reaching toward the jaw. Up close, the detail of it was extraordinary. Someone had spent a very long time on that ink. It did not look like decoration. It looked like declaration. He looked at Amara. For a moment, the three of them existed in a configuration that held everything the evening had built. The mother with her closed fan and her immovable certainty, the son standing between his mother's voice and his own want, and the woman in red sitting at the table that she had not been invited to and had not left. "I want to see you again," he said. He said it without calculating at first. She could tell. There was no architecture to the sentence, no protective framing, no exit built into it. It arrived the way things arrived when people stopped managing themselves for a single unguarded second and simply said what was true. Madame Kwan's chin lifted by a fraction of a degree. Her fan did not move. Amara reached for the gold clutch on the table beside her, closed her fingers around it, rose from her chair slowly, and the rising was its own kind of statement. Unhurried, complete, taking up exactly as much space and time as she needed, and not 1 second less. She stood before him with the stilettos bringing her to within a single centimeter of his eye level, and she held his gaze with the same directness she had carried across that ballroom floor 2 hours ago. "I know," she said. She did not offer a number, did not confirm a time or a place, did not give him the comfort of logistics. She gave him the one thing she had that no one else in his life had apparently thought to offer. The truth, stated plainly without softening and without strategy. She knew. And he knew that she knew. And the knowing was enough. She turned and walked toward the exit corridor with the same unhurried certainty of her arrival, the red dress moving with her through the thinning crowd, the gold accessories catching the chandelier light one last time before she passed through the doors and into the cool night air of Gangnam and disappeared. Behind her, in the ballroom, the silence at the VIP table lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Madame Kwan turned to look at her son. Chaewon was still looking at the door. "Chaewon," she said. He did not answer immediately, and in the space of that delay, in the 3 seconds between her saying his name and him finally turning to meet her eyes, Kwon Myung-hee understood, with the cold precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and people and the spaces between them, that something had already changed. She did not know yet how much. She did not know yet that the woman in red was already 3 things simultaneously. The problem she needed to eliminate, the variable she had not accounted for, and the first person in years who had looked at her son like he was something worth looking at. What she knew was simpler and more urgent. She needed to make a call. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the birthday celebration. Amara was at her desk in the Atlas office in Mapo-gu, working through a contract translation that required her to hold 3 legal frameworks in her head simultaneously, when her phone lit up with a number she did not recognize. She let it ring twice, not from hesitation, but from the discipline of finishing the sentence she was reading before she allowed anything to interrupt it. Then she picked up. The voice on the other end was immediately recognizable. Smooth, low, constructed with the precision of someone who had never in 6 decades allowed a word to escape her mouth that she had not first examined from every angle. "Come and see me," Madame Kwan said. "Alone. Do not tell my son." There was no greeting, no preamble, no explanation of how she had obtained the number, which was itself a message, a demonstration, quiet and complete, of the kind of reach that did not need to announce itself, because announcing it would diminish it. Amara held the phone against her ear and looked at the contract translation on her screen for one long moment. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. I'll be there." The line closed. Amara set the phone face down on the desk and sat with the information for exactly 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself to simply feel things before she began deciding what to do with them. In those 30 seconds, she felt the wariness of a woman who understood that an invitation from Madame Kwon Myung-hee was never only an invitation. She felt the particular alertness of someone who had spent her professional life reading subtext and knew that every element of this call, the unannounced number, the absence of greeting, the instruction not to tell Jae-won, was its own deliberate sentence in a language she was only beginning to learn the grammar of. And underneath the wariness and the alertness, she felt something else, something quieter. Curiosity. The kind that arrived not from recklessness, but from the genuine desire to understand something she did not yet fully understand. She went. The Kwon family residence in Sungbuk-dong sat behind walls that did not announce themselves. The architecture was traditional in its bones. Low rooflines, natural stone. The measured geometry of a hanok expanded and refined across generations into something that was simultaneously historic and entirely private. The gardens were extraordinary. Even in the contained formality of their arrangement, something in them breathed. Old trees whose roots had been growing here longer than anyone living could account for. Their branches reaching in directions that no landscape architect had planned. A staff member met her at the gate and led her through the main courtyard and around to a garden space at the eastern side of the property, open to the pale afternoon sky, where a low table had been set with 2 cups and a celadon teapot that Amara recognized immediately as antique. Madame Kwon was already seated on a cushion beside the table, her posture the posture of a woman for whom sitting on the floor of her own garden was not casualness, but another form of authority. This is my earth. This is my space. I have been here longer than you, and I will be here after. She was wearing a simpler hanbok today, pale gray with silver thread at the cuffs. The fan was on the table beside the teapot, closed. Amara sat across from her. She did not wait to be invited to sit. She simply sat, with the same unhurried completeness with which she did everything, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she met the older woman's eyes, and she waited. Madame Kwon poured the tea, both cups. She did not ask if Amara wanted any. She poured it as a statement of the proceedings. This is how this will go. This is the shape of this meeting. We will drink tea, and I will say what I have brought you here to say. She set the teapot down. She looked at Amara. I underestimated you, she said. The words arrived without introduction and without apology. They were not an apology. They were an assessment, stated with the same directness that a general might use to acknowledge a tactical error. Not from remorse, but from the discipline of accuracy. A woman like Madame Kwon did not survive 6 decades at the center of a dynasty by refusing to name her miscalculations. She named them, she studied them, and then she corrected. Amara received the words without expression. She lifted her teacup and held it in both hands and waited for what came next, because she understood with complete clarity that this was not the destination of the sentence. It was the departure point. You knew, Madame Kwon continued, exactly what you were doing when you walked to that table. It was positioned as a statement. It carried a question inside it. Amara considered the full truth of this for a moment, because she had always believed that the moments which most deserved honesty were precisely the moments when dishonesty would be easiest and most convenient. No, she said. Not exactly. The older woman's eyes sharpened slightly. When you said what you said to me, Amara continued, her voice even and without heat, I didn't have a plan. I had a feeling. And the feeling was that any man whose mother works that hard to control who looks at him. She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing the words with care. Has probably spent his whole life waiting for someone who wouldn't ask permission first. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere beyond the wall, the city moved through its Thursday afternoon with complete indifference. Madame Kwan was silent for a long moment. Her eyes did not leave Amara's face. They moved across it the way eyes moved across a document, reading, cross-referencing, checking one line against another for consistency. You are very perceptive, she said finally. The words were not warm, but they were real. And from this woman, in this garden, real was worth more than warm. It's my profession, Amara said. It is more than your profession. Madame Kwan set her teacup down with the precise placement of someone who put things exactly where she intended them. My son has been managed his entire life. His position, his associations, his trajectory. A pause. By me. Because someone had to, and his father died before he was ready, and I did what needed to be done. She said this without defensiveness. She said it the way people stated facts they had long since stopped needing to justify. But underneath the factual delivery, Amara heard something. Faint and almost entirely sealed, but there. The exhaustion of a woman who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had never once set it down because setting it down was not something she knew how to do. He resents it, Amara said. Not cruelly, as observation. He does, Madame Kwan agreed. And he is also entirely unequipped to function without it, because I never taught him how. Because teaching him how would have meant releasing him. She looked at the teapot. And I did not know how to release what I had spent everything building. The silence that followed this was different from the silences that had preceded it. It had a different weight. The kind of weight that arrived when something true had been said out loud for what might have been the first time, and the air around it was still adjusting to the fact of it. He was alive that night, Madame Kwan said. In a way, I have not seen him alive in years. And I watched you walk away, and I watched him watch you walk away. She looked back at Amara. Something in her face had shifted, not softened exactly, because this was not a woman who softened, but adjusted, recalibrated towards something more honest than her default. He is more fragile than he appears. The armor is very convincing, but I built it, so I know what is underneath. Amara felt the words land somewhere deep and careful inside her. Take care of him, Madame Kwan said. It arrived quietly, without the commanding architecture of her usual speech. It arrived the way requests arrived from people who almost never made them, stripped of everything except the bare truth of the need. That is not a small thing you're asking, Amara said. No, the older woman agreed. It is not. They sat together in the garden for another 20 minutes. They did not resolve everything. They did not pretend to. But something had been placed on the table between them. Not agreement, exactly. Not approval, exactly. But the beginning of a different kind of understanding. The kind that does not arrive through declarations, but through the slow accumulation of two people deciding, separately and simultaneously, that the truth is more useful than the performance. When Amara told Chaewon that evening, all of it, the call, the garden, the tea, every word his mother had said, he went very still in the way that he went still when something had moved through him that he had not prepared for. He stood at the window of his apartment looking out at the lights of Seoul for a long time without speaking. She said that? His voice was quiet. Not the controlled quiet of the man in the ballroom. Something younger than that. Something that had not yet learned to be armored. She said that, Amara confirmed. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the room, the woman who had walked to his table uninvited and sat down without asking and told him the truth without softening it, and had gone to meet his mother alone and come back and was still here, standing in his apartment at 9 in the evening with her coat still on, looking at him like she intended to keep looking at him for a considerable amount of time. "I think I am afraid of you," he said. She crossed the room toward him. She raised her hand and placed it against his face, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who understood that this particular man needed time to receive things without retreating from them. And she held it there, her palm warm against his jaw, her thumb near the edge of the tattoo at his neck. "Good," she said. "People who have never been afraid of anything rarely learn anything worth knowing." He did not answer. He did not need to. He raised his hand and covered hers where it rested against his face, and the city burned gold and endless outside the window, and Seoul moved through its night the way it always had. Ancient and relentless and entirely indifferent to the small, irreversible thing that had just finished happening inside one of its high windows. 6 months later, at the Kwon family's year-end gathering, the most formal and attended event in the family's calendar, the one where presence meant something and absence meant more, Amara arrived in midnight blue this time, and Madame Kwon was already seated at the head of the family table when she entered the room. The matriarch looked up. She gestured once to the empty chair directly beside her. Amara walked to it, sat down, unfolded her napkin with the same unhurried completeness with which she did everything. Madame Kwon did not say welcome. She did not say, "I approve." She said nothing at all. She simply reached for her teacup and lifted it, and the evening began, and the empty chair was empty no longer, and in the particular language of a family that communicated everything in implication and architecture and the precise meaning of where a person was permitted to sit, that was more than enough. It was, in the end, the loudest thing Madame Kwon had ever said. And the woman who had been told she did not belong in this world had not fought her way into it, had not begged her way into it, had not diminished herself by a single degree to fit inside it. She had simply walked in red, and stayed. Amara didn't fight her way into that room. She didn't beg. She didn't shrink. She didn't change the dress, soften the walk, or lower her eyes when the most powerful woman in Seoul told her, quietly, deliberately, like a door being closed, that she didn't belong there. She picked up her champagne glass and walked toward the table anyway. That is not a small thing. That is a woman who has spent a lifetime being told no by the wrong people, and learned, somewhere along the way, that the wrong person's no is just a direction. And if that moved something in you tonight, if you recognized something in Amara, that particular kind of tired that comes not from weakness, but from carrying yourself through spaces that were never designed for you, and doing it beautifully, and doing it alone, then I want you to hear this. You deserve a ritual that honors that woman. Not a quick fix, not a trend. A real, intentional practice, built specifically for your skin, your hair, your season of life. Korean Glass Skin Secrets for Black Queens 45 Plus is exactly that. A complete system designed for mature black skin. The skin that carries melanin, history, and a resilience that no one in any ballroom could ever take from you. Inside, you'll find the full AM and PM Korean skincare routine adapted for your skin. The 15-star ingredients that actually work for hyperpigmentation, collagen loss, and deep hydration. A 30-day glass skin challenge that builds everything step by step. The glass hair ritual, the Korean scalp-first method for type 4C and 4B mature hair. 7 Jimjilbang spa rituals you can do at home, in your own bathroom, on your schedule. And 12 Korean botanical teas, including the viral Korean retinol tea, that work on your skin from the inside out, the way no cream ever could. Amara walked into that ballroom in red and stayed. Your ritual starts the same way, with the decision to show up for yourself, completely, without asking anyone's permission. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or find the link in the description and in the pinned comment below. You already know you belong here. Now let your skin know it too. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room where everything around you was designed to make you feel like you didn't belong, and chose to stay anyway? Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told that who you are simply wasn't enough for someone else's world, and had to find the strength to prove that the only permission you ever needed was your own? And what about the walls we build around the people we love, thinking we are protecting them, never realizing we may be the very cage they are desperate to escape? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, courage, and the quiet power of refusing to shrink, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.